Ida Lockwood had always considered her neighborhood on Camellia Ridge to be a safe haven. Well-kept lawns, friendly greetings, and a calm that hung over the place like a warm quilt. So, when she heard a frantic cry outside her window and saw her neighbor Henry Yates collapse on his driveway, she ran to her door with her heart hammering in her chest. Something was very wrong. Henry, a widower in his late 70s, had moved to Camellia Ridge a decade earlier, right after his wife, Donna, passed away. He was soft-spoken, a man of regular habits. A quiet stroll at dawn, the newspaper delivered precisely at 6, Sunday breakfast to the diner. Though he wasn't outgoing, he was courteous and kind in the small ways that mattered. One might notice him picking up stray trash near the mailbox or trimming the neglected shrubs near the community entrance. Most folks simply waved hello and scurried back to their own obligations. Rarely did anyone see him so distressed or disoriented, certainly not lying there, prone and trembling. Ida flung open her front door, took a single step forward, and froze. Standing in her path was Carl Ackerman, the new head of the Camellia Ridge Homeowners Association. With a stiff posture and a face painted in alarm, he raised a hand at her. "Ida, call 911 if you have to, but don't get any closer." She blinked. "But, Carl, can't you see? Henry's collapsed. He could be having a heart attack." Carl's voice cracked with tension as he waved for another neighbor, Sharon, to hang back. "I'm aware, Ida. Liability. That's the word. The HOA board has rules against residents providing medical assistance if they're not certified. This might sound cold, but we're trying to protect the association from legal repercussions if something goes wrong. I've already called an ambulance." In Ida's mind, there was only one decent response: rush over and help Henry. Yet Carl's stark words rattled her. She'd read about such policies in their monthly bulletins, but never took them seriously. This was Henry they were talking about, a man likely dying on the ground right in front of them. Could there really be a rule so strict it stopped them from rushing to a neighbor's aid? As if reading her thoughts, Carl's gaze dropped. His mouth twisted into a grimace of guilt, but he didn't budge. "Don't. Please." Conflicting emotions surged through Ida's body. Outrage, shock, confusion. Henry's face was grimacing with pain, and his breath came in wheezing gasps. How could she, in good conscience, stay put? And yet, behind her, Sharon was calling out, "They're on their way. The ambulance is on its way," like some sort of mantra. Everyone around seemed immobilized. A silent conflict paralyzed the small group of neighbors, forming an uneasy circle on the sidewalk. Ida inched forward with cautious defiance. "Rules or no rules, I'm not going to let him suffer like this." She bent down beside Henry, ignoring the sharp, scolding voices from behind. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingertips. She tried to talk to him the way she'd learned in her old first aid class decades ago. "Henry, can you hear me? It's Ida Lockwood from across the street." His lips parted, but all she heard was a hushed moan. At that moment, the whining siren of an ambulance sounded in the distance. Relief and shame crashed together inside Ida, tangling in her gut. In the end, paramedics arrived. Henry was whisked away, pale and trembling, strapped to a gurney while Carl dutifully stepped aside, repeating phrases about liability coverage and disclaimers. The rest of the neighbors drifted back to their porches, uncertain and somewhat relieved to let the professionals handle the crisis. But Ida couldn't just brush this off. All evening long, she thought about Henry. Had he been alone in that big, empty house all day, feeling some warning signs but too proud to call for help? She remembered his stoic nature, never wanting to be a burden, especially after losing his wife. And she thought about the HOA's stance. Could it truly be that the fear of lawsuits held more power than compassion? The next day, Ida tried to get information about Henry's condition. The hospital representative told her that Henry was stable. He'd experienced cardiac stress, serious enough to keep him under observation for a while. Relieved, Ida asked if Henry had any relatives. The nurse on the line sighed. "Not that we've seen. We're still searching. If you're a friend, maybe you should stop by or give him a call." That was all Ida needed to hear. Although she wasn't a close friend, not in the typical sense, she felt an overwhelming drive to do something. After all, They were neighbors, and Camellia Ridge had long prided itself on being a tight-knit community. Despite last night's fiasco with Carl and his misguided interpretation of regulations, Ida was determined to make sure Henry wasn't alone. She just hoped the HOA wouldn't try to stand in her way again. Ida never once imagined that it would only be the beginning of a much darker chain of events, one where fear, protocol, and a deeply flawed system would converge to write a tragic ending. Tucked beneath layers of legalese and official disclaimers, the Camellia Ridge HOA guidelines had, over the years, grown more rigid and complicated. The stated mission was always the same: protect property values, ensure resident safety, and promote a harmonious environment. But within those polite parameters lived a labyrinth of rules, a tangle of do's and don'ts that left most residents shaking their heads at how thoroughly every aspect of daily life could be policed. When Ida was a younger woman, rules carried a certain practicality. A well-lit neighborhood? Yes, that was essential for safety. Lawn maintenance? Sure, it kept the place nice. But over time, the HOA's leadership changed, adopting increasingly stringent policies, especially regarding liability. Stories had circulated about a neighbor who once helped an elderly woman home during a storm, only to face a litigious threat from her adult son when she slipped in his foyer. Lawsuits, or even the hint of them, had turned the friendly atmosphere in Camellia Ridge into one of cautious withdrawal. Carl Ackerman embodied this new era. He'd been the face of the board for less than a year, but in that time, he issued near-weekly reminders of the association's regulations. No physical assistance was to be provided without explicit consent from the board or proof of medical certification. Even if it was something as simple as driving a neighbor to a clinic, they strongly discouraged an absurd word choice for what amounted to a threat. Ignoring the rule could result in fines or, in severe cases, legal action. Ida remembered reading these policies, but found them so heartless that she brushed them off as overblown legal nonsense. After Henry's collapse, however, she realized these rules were all too real, and it frightened her. Where did decency fit in an environment like this? Several days after Henry's hospital stay, Ida decided to pay him a visit. Dreading another confrontation with Carl, she quickly brushed aside the notion and headed straight to Henry's place. She carried a small casserole in hand, still warm in the aluminum pan, a classic neighborly gesture. She found Henry seated in a plastic lawn chair on his front porch, wearing a cardigan despite the midday sun. His stooped shoulders were thinner than she remembered, his face etched with a dull weariness. "Henry, dear," Ida called softly, "I'm so relieved you're out of the hospital." He turned at the sound of her voice, attempting a smile. "I guess I'm glad too," he rasped, patting his chest. "Still feel it in here, though." He gestured vaguely to his heart. Then he added, "Thanks for coming by." Ida offered the casserole, but he politely declined. "I appreciate it. I do. I'm just not up for much eating yet." He stood as if it pained him to do so, moving aside so she could place the dish on a small table. It was obvious he was trying to be gracious, though his eyes gave away his exhaustion. "Are you getting any home care?" she pressed gently. Henry hesitated, then admitted social worker came by. They recommended a part-time nurse. "But I'm not sure if I can afford that. I have my pension, but it's not much." Ida nodded sympathetically. "Well, if you need any help, you can call me. That's what neighbors are for." A shadow crossed Henry's face. He cleared his throat and said in a low tone, "I appreciate it, Ida, but let's just say I got a visit from Carl a couple of days ago. I know you tried to help when I collapsed. Frankly, I'm thankful you did, but Carl warned me about letting other residents risk themselves on my behalf." Henry sighed, a pained expression creeping across his features. He said the association can't be held responsible if something happens to me on private property, especially if a fellow resident is involved. It's all about liability, apparently. He urged me to sign some statement saying I wouldn't ask neighbors for physical assistance. Can you believe that? Ida's mouth fell open. That's outrageous. He can't possibly expect you to sign such a thing. He already gave me the papers, Henry answered, voice tinged with helpless anger. Said it was for my own good and the neighborhood's good. His words faltered. I just don't want to stir up trouble She saw the sadness brimming behind his eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical ailment. This was a man who'd lost his wife, who had no close family, who just wanted a sense of peace and dignity. It's not trouble, Ida insisted gently. It's compassion. Those HOA rules might be on the books, but that doesn't mean they're right. Somebody's got to stand up. Henry gave a shaky half-smile. I appreciate that, but sometimes fighting these battles doesn't seem worth it, especially when you're already running on fumes. In the days that followed, Ida did what she could without drawing undue attention. She took Henry's trash bin to the curb late at night, so no one would see. She made a point of calling him to check in, ensuring at least some contact. Meanwhile, she found herself at odds with the intangible fortress of HOA regulations. It was shocking how many neighbors actually grumbled about them in private, but wouldn't risk stepping forward. A low simmer of tension settled over Camellia Ridge. Rumors spread that a revised handbook would circulate soon, including even more disclaimers about offering medical assistance. People whispered about how easy it was to get into hot water with the board. Fines in the hundreds of dollars have been slapped on some residents for lesser violations, like painting their front doors a shade off the approved color palette. As for Carl, he seemed oblivious to the moral quandary. Each time Ida saw him, he wore the same pressed polo shirt and a crisp expression of authority, brandishing a calm smile that belied the severity of the rules he enforced. Every conversation felt robotic, filled with phrases like best interests and we're all safer if we follow protocol, while compassion crumbled beneath the weight of liability fears. Ida promised herself she'd do whatever it took to help Henry, quietly, under the radar. If she faced a fine, so be it. But in her heart, she had a nagging fear. Was she too late to stop a tragedy that was slowly, inexorably, building on her very street? By the time summer rolled in, a stifling heat wave baked Camellia Ridge, driving people indoors. Air conditioners hummed day and night, and the usually tidy lawns turned brown under the relentless sun. The asphalt shimmered like a black lake on the horizon. For Henry, the heat spelled trouble. The doctors had advised him to avoid strain, but his aging AC unit was prone to breakdowns, and his limited budget strained under the costly repairs. Ida, thinking ahead, called a local charity service that sometimes helps seniors with basic home needs. They assigned a volunteer to inspect Henry's AC unit. A simple fix, it turned out, just a worn belt and a clogged filter. Ida felt a surge of relief, imagining Henry sitting comfortably in a cooled living room instead of fainting from heat exhaustion. What she didn't foresee was the way the HOA would react. 2 days later, Carl appeared at her doorstep with a polite knock, accompanied by that ever-present artificial smile. "Good afternoon, Ida." He rocked on his heels, clasping a slim file in his hands. "I'm here to talk about an incident on Henry Yates's property." "Incident?" Ida repeated, startled. Carl inclined his head. "A third party entered the premises to perform maintenance without seeking the HOA's approval. That's a violation, potentially. We have licensed contractors under contract with us, you see. We must ensure the individuals who come into our community are properly vetted and insured. For liability reasons." Ida's blood pressure spiked. It was a volunteer, someone helping Henry because his AC was busted. "Is that really an incident?" Carl's eyes hardened slightly. "I do understand your concern, but that's how things escalate, unfortunately. Non-contracted personnel can pose serious risks, faulty repairs, potential for lawsuits if something goes wrong. I'm afraid the board will have to consider a fine." All the anger Ida had tamped down rose swiftly. "A fine? Carl." Henry nearly had a heat stroke. "He's an older man recovering from a heart issue. Are we supposed to let him suffer because your list of approved contractors might take a week or two to show up and overcharge him?" Carl took a breath. "The rules are clear, Ida. It's not personal." She cut him off, voice trembling with suppressed rage. "But it should be personal. That's what a community is, people caring about each other. All you seem to care about is liability and lawsuits." Carl's lips formed a thin line. "I'll take your thoughts under advisement. Expect a written warning, and if it happens again, there'll be monetary penalties." With that, he slipped away, leaving Ida speechless and shaking. She realized she couldn't stand by any longer and watched the bureaucracy pile on a man who had no strength left to fight. After slamming her door, she took a moment to calm herself, then grabbed her phone and started contacting other neighbors. Over the next few days, she managed to rally half a dozen people who shared her outrage. The group gathered in Ida's living room one evening. Sharon, who originally hesitated on Henry's lawn that first day. Mark, a retired firefighter who couldn't stand the idea of rules preventing basic first aid. Alice, who used to run a local community outreach program, and a few others. Over mugs of coffee, they debated ways to help Henry without triggering more fines. Alice shook her head in frustration. It's madness. Henry's a proud man. He doesn't like to ask for help, but we can't let him suffer. The board needs to be confronted. Mark's gruff voice rumbled from the couch. They're just folks. They put their pants on one leg at a time, like the rest of us. Let's meet with them face to face. Ida frowned. I'm not sure how far that'll get us. They're already entrenched. Look at Carl. He's just their mouthpiece. Then maybe we go over their heads, Alice suggested. This community is in the city's jurisdiction. We could talk to a council member or the local media. Shine a light on these ridiculous policies. Press them to back down. The group murmured in agreement, but Mark hesitated. I don't want to see Henry become a public spectacle. He's already fragile. We can't just parade him around to prove a point. Ida looked out her living room window, eyes drifting toward Henry's darkened house. She imagined him sitting alone, possibly struggling to breathe in the sweltering heat. Let's first try to talk to Henry, she said quietly. We need to see what he's comfortable with. If he's willing, maybe we present his story to the city council. If not, we respect that and just keep doing what we can under the radar. The next day, Ida marched over and knocked on Henry's door. No one answered. She called his phone. No response. Panic started to coil in her stomach. She found him eventually in his backyard, shakily watering some wilted plants. He jumped at the sound of her footsteps. Goodness, Ida, he gasped, pressing a hand to his chest. You scare me half to death. She apologized, scanning his sweaty brow and the unsteady way he stood. Henry, you shouldn't be out here. If you need help, call me, please. We're neighbors. That's what we do. Look out for each other. A blend of embarrassment and gratitude washed over Henry's features. I know, and I'm thankful, but you don't understand how it feels to have the HOA breathing down your neck. They already asked me to sign that paper, promising not to rely on neighborly assistance. If I go around violating that, I could face all sorts of trouble. Fines I can't pay, or they might even threaten to foreclose on my home. They can do that, you know. Ida's heart sank. They can't. Not for that. At least, I don't think so. But even as she said the words, she realized she wasn't entirely sure. She'd heard stories of HOA boards resorting to extreme measures. Henry shrugged. Don't want to find out. I'm just trying to get by. Still, Ida pressed on, telling him about the small group that wanted to help. We could approach the city council, or maybe even local news outlets. Let people see how your story illustrates what's wrong with these rules. Then maybe the HOA will back down. Henry's expression changed at the mention of publicity. A long silence thickened between them. I appreciate the thought, he said finally, but I don't want to be a poster boy for anything. I have enough on my plate trying to breathe and stay out of debt. But I also don't want this happening to someone else down the line. Ida recognized the conflict in his eyes. He was torn, desperate not to cause trouble, yet also aware this was bigger than him alone. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Think it over. We'll respect whatever you decide. Walking away, Ida felt a weight settle on her chest. They were dealing with forces that thrived in shadows. Thick rulebooks no one read. Vague threats that everyone feared. How to fight that? She didn't have the answer. But she did know, deep down, that time was working against them. Henry's health wasn't improving, and the summer heat showed no mercy. A sense of urgency gnawed at her. She had no idea then how much more dire Henry's situation would soon become. One suffocating afternoon, the power blinked off throughout Camellia Ridge. Rolling blackouts weren't uncommon during heat waves, and the electricity company had already warned everyone to expect intermittent outages. Yet somehow, The neighborhood still reeled in panic whenever the lights flickered out, air conditioners silenced, and fans sputtered to a halt. Ida was in her kitchen, rummaging for a cold compress, when the power vanished. Immediately, her mind flew to Henry. She grabbed her phone, but couldn't get through. Cell coverage wavered during these blackouts, and landlines were a rarity these days. Anxiety prickled at her, so she hurried onto her front porch. The sun bore down mercilessly. Droplets of sweat gathered at her temples. She glanced across the street at Henry's house. The curtains were drawn, but no sign of him. With a grim sense of purpose, she jogged across the street. She tried the front door. Locked. She knocked, called his name, and waited. The air was so still that her own heartbeat sounded like thunder in her ears. "Henry? It's Ida. Please open up if you can." Nothing. Twisting around, she noticed a cluster of neighbors gathering down the block. A small figure trudged up the sidewalk, Sharon. "Ida, I'm worried about him too," she said shakily. "There's no AC. He might not be able to manage." Ida nodded. "I'm going to check the back door." Sure enough, the back door was also locked, but through the thin drapes on a side window, Ida could see movement. Henry, slumped in an armchair, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Ida banged on the window. "Henry, are you okay?" No response. Her gut clenched. She tried the window, locked. By now, Sharon had joined her, eyes darting nervously up and down the alley, as though expecting Carl and his minions to appear any second. "Do we break in?" Sharon asked, swallowing hard. Ida hesitated for a half-second, but one look at Henry's limp form through the glass answered her question. "We do." She grabbed a small garden rock and smashed it against the window's edge. Glass cracked, splintering into dagger-shaped shards. The noise was jarring, but adrenaline propelled her. Sharon helped clear the frame of broken glass, and Ida carefully hoisted herself inside. The air was stifling, easily above 90 degrees. Henry's face was flushed and clammy, sweat pooling at his temples. "Henry," she whispered urgently, patting his cheek. His eyelids fluttered, but no coherent words came. In a frenzy, Ida and Sharon found a lukewarm washcloth in the kitchen, pressed it to Henry's forehead, opened windows to let in even a hint of a breeze. The phone lines were dead, but Sharon finally got her cell to work enough to dial 911. "We have an elderly man suffering what looks like heat exhaustion. Maybe heat stroke," she reported, voice trembling. Minutes stretched like hours. Henry's shallow breathing rattled in Ida's ears, and panic gnawed at her. She tried to keep him conscious, talking softly about anything. Flowers, the old diner, how she once saw him rescue a stray cat. She prayed the ambulance would arrive quickly. When she heard sirens in the distance, relief crashed over her. The paramedics pounded on the front door, eventually circling to the broken window to access the house. They lifted Henry onto a stretcher, hooking him up to oxygen. The lead paramedic eyed the shards of glass and asked, "What happened here?" Ida mustered a hoarse answer. "We had a break-in. He was alone, unconscious in the heat." She added uncertainly, "Are we in trouble?" He shook his head. "I'm just glad you got him help." With that, they whisked Henry to the hospital yet again. In the wake of the ambulance's departure, Ida's heartbeat pounded with a mix of worry and indignation. Once again, the community had nearly lost Henry. Once again, she and a neighbor had acted, but only in the final moments, fearful of the consequences. And she knew, she just knew, the HOA wasn't going to be pleased about property damage and unapproved entry. Sure enough, 2 hours later, the power came back on, and so did her phone. Messages poured in. Mark calling to see if Henry was okay, Alice wanting updates. Then, to her dismay, a curt voicemail from Carl. "Ida, this is Carl Ackerman. I've been informed that you forced entry into Mr. Yates's house. We understand it was an emergency, but it still constitutes a clear violation of HOA regulations and private property protections. We'll need to schedule a formal hearing with the board. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." Ida deleted the message, hands trembling. She cared nothing about their hearing. All that mattered was Henry's survival. But a dark chill of realization settled on her. This was escalating. The rules were now overshadowing basic humanity. If the board pressed charges or levied heavy fines, Henry could be left penniless or, horrifyingly, homeless. For the first time, she seriously considered calling the local news station. Maybe making a public fuss was the only way to break through this moral insanity. Still, she hesitated. She'd promised to respect Henry's wishes, and part of that meant not turning his private struggles into a spectacle. But how many more close calls could he survive, left at the mercy of scorching temperatures, a failing heart, and a neighborhood too afraid of legal repercussions to lend a proper hand? Late that night, as Ida paced her living room, her phone buzzed. It was a nurse from the hospital, letting her know Henry was stabilized and resting. She felt a small wave of relief wash over her, though it was quickly drowned out by the next bit of news. He's weak, Ida. There are complications. We'd recommend a round-the-clock caregiver, especially with his heart condition. The nurse paused, voice gentling. I'm not sure how else to put it. He's in a very precarious state. Ida thanked the nurse, tears stinging her eyes. A precarious state. She wondered if Henry's final days, or weeks, or months, would be reduced to a desperate struggle against not just his own fragile health, but an HOA determined to keep him isolated. If that was the definition of harmonious community, Ida wanted no part of it. She remembered Henry's uncertain acceptance. I don't want to become a poster boy, but I also don't want anyone else to go through this. That statement echoed hauntingly in her mind. Maybe it was time to speak out, to push back against the clamp of regulations that stifled compassion. She vowed that once Henry was stable enough, she'd ask him, was he ready to take this fight public? Ida had no crystal ball to foresee how swiftly fate would seal their decision. But it was becoming clearer by the day. If something drastic didn't change soon, Henry's next emergency could be his last. 2 weeks passed, the heat wave finally broke, and in that brief window, Henry returned home once more, weaker than ever. Nights had grown milder, as if the weather itself were offering a token reprieve. But Henry's condition didn't improve. Too many close calls had chipped away at whatever reserves of strength he possessed. He moved in slow, pained steps. Neighbors who dared to defy the HOA tiptoed over with casseroles, fresh fruit, the occasional yard check. They kept it secret. Nobody wanted to risk a confrontation with Carl or be called to a dreaded formal hearing. Despite their caution, rumors circulated that the board was gathering evidence for violations, photographs, statements. Fines loomed. Some folks were spooked into steering clear. Ida, meanwhile, increased her calls to local charities, city resource centers, and even tried contacting an attorney friend. But every lead circled back to the same problem. The HOA had broad powers, and Henry, feeling overwhelmed, wasn't sure how far he wanted to push the legal fight. I'm just tired, he kept telling Ida. I can't deal with the stress. One early morning, Ida found him slumped on the steps leading up to his porch, fiddling with a set of keys. He was breathless just from that minor exertion. Ida asked gently, "You okay?" "I need to pick up my medication," he wheezed. "Pharmacy's just a mile away, but I'm not supposed to drive." He held up shaking fingers. "Doctor's orders. But the HOA. Carl told me they'd issue a statement of risk if I accept rides from neighbors. Something about unauthorized transport. How if we got in an accident, I could sue them. It's insane." Ida's heart seized. She reached for the keys, speaking softly but firmly. "This is nonsense. You're coming with me. I'll drive you to get your medication." Henry hesitated, scanning the quiet street as though expecting an HOA enforcer to leap out from behind shrub. Then he nodded. "All right," he said heavily. "All right." On the short drive to the pharmacy, Henry leaned his head back against the seat, eyes closed. His face was gaunt, colorless. When they arrived, Ida, parked carefully, reached over to unfasten his seatbelt for him. He gave her a small, grateful nod, an echo of the vibrant man he'd once been. They got the medication. On the way home, a resolute thought formed in Ida's mind. This is ridiculous. I'm driving a sick neighbor to pick up vital medicine. If the HOA wants to punish me for that, so be it. She decided she'd talk to Henry again about going public. ignoring her reservations about making him a poster boy. Enough was enough. But Henry never got that far. Later that evening, while Ida was tidying her kitchen, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered, and a strangled voice on the other end said, "Is this Ida Lockwood?" "Yes," she replied. "I'm calling from Camellia General Hospital. Your number was listed as an emergency contact for Mr. Henry Yates. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Yates collapsed in his home. The paramedics." Ida's breath caught in her throat. "Where is he now?" The voice softened. "He didn't make it, ma'am. He was pronounced dead at the scene." For a moment, Ida couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She stared at the floor as if trying to see past it, to the beating heart of the earth, searching for some anchor. But the nurse's words echoed in her mind. He didn't make it. She felt her own heart pounding, and when she tried to swallow, her throat refused. The next few days were a blur. Arrangements, phone calls, tears. Henry had listed Ida as a contact because there was no one else. He died alone, in the single-story bungalow where he'd tried to manage in quiet dignity. Speculation spread. Did he stumble and fall? Did his heart simply give out? No one knew for sure. But the outcome was the same: a solitary death in a community weighed down by rules that discouraged any real help. A wave of anger and sorrow collided inside Ida. In her grief, she realized the real tragedy wasn't just Henry's death, but the stifling environment that prevented neighbors from being neighbors. He died alone, yes, but he also lived in fear. Fear that receiving help would bring down the iron hammer of an HOA more interested in legal disclaimers than basic decency. In the aftermath, the local paper briefly covered the story, describing Henry as a reclusive senior citizen found deceased. No mention of the HOA or the stymied efforts of neighbors trying to help. But Ida wouldn't let it rest. She asked Mark, the retired firefighter, to connect her with reporters who might be interested in a bigger story. Within a week, an investigative journalist named Donna Price visited Camellia Ridge, knocking on doors and asking uncomfortable questions. The HOA bristled. Carl refused to comment, standing behind a bland statement about community guidelines existing for the common good. A handful of neighbors, mostly from Ida's small group, went on record to describe how rules had limited their ability to help Henry. A city council member took notice, promising to review the situation. For a while, it seemed that Henry's death might spark change. But HOAs often have deep pockets and ways to deflect criticism. Carl dug in his heels. He insisted the policies were standard, that Henry's personal choices were at fault for not hiring professional care. Factual or not, it muddied the waters. Some residents, worried about rising property values, sided with Carl to keep the neighborhood's clean reputation intact. Yet Ida felt a subtle shift in the air, a quiet awakening. Neighbors exchanged hushed words at mailboxes, expressing regret that they didn't intervene sooner. Some placed flowers in front of Henry's porch, forming a small memorial that drew the eye of passing cars. The sight was heart-wrenching. Bouquets, handwritten notes, a flickering candle behind a glass jar. A testament, however belated, to a man who'd been more than a liability risk or a line in the rulebook. Ida knelt before the memorial one evening, tears tracking down her cheeks, whispering a soft goodbye to Henry. A neighbor came up behind her, Sharon, with eyes reddened by guilt. She rested a hand on Ida's shoulder and said, "I wish we could have done more." Ida nodded. "So do I." In that moment, she realized that sometimes all it takes is a handful of determined individuals to push back against the system. Henry died alone, but perhaps his death wouldn't be entirely in vain. Perhaps it was the catalyst for a larger reckoning. Grief was a strange, relentless teacher. It reminded people that life was too brief and too precious to be choked by petty rules. Maybe Henry's story would finally force Camellia Ridge to ask, at what point does protecting property values become more important than protecting the people who actually live here? Ida stared at the wilted flowers, then glanced up at Sharon. "We'll keep fighting," she whispered. "We owe him that." And in the twilight hush of Camellia Ridge, with an old man's shadow lingering, the final truth was laid bare. A community that fears helping one another is a community doomed to lose its soul. Henry Yates might be gone, but his memory would stand as a silent challenge, an indictment of rules that stripped compassion away until it was too late. The end.